Welcome to Leading by Example, Upholding Standards Without Compromise. I am your host, Dr. Vaughn, inspiring excellence, one lesson at a time. Are you ready to be better within your world and become the standard bearer within your organization or wherever you are? Leaders, aspirants, every one of you, all of us influence our culture, the organization's culture, our workplace's culture through actions taken both inside and outside of the workplace. I founded Ontero Solutions upon integrity, customer satisfaction, and attention to detail, specifically executive coaching and leadership development. Join in for fun, practical, and educational stories as I share lessons, both the good and the bad, that I have learned in my 20 years of leadership and management experience. Leading by example starts now. Hello, and welcome. Today, we are beginning a new series titled The Ripple Effect, How One Ethical Choice Can Inspire Many. So this two-part series illustrates how ethical choices, particularly those made in challenging circumstances, can create a domino effect of positive actions and attitudes and foster a broader commitment to integrity and responsibility. So in the first episode, which is titled The Power of Ethical Leadership, we will explore how the ethical choices of leaders play a pivotal role in shaping the values, behaviors, and cultural norms within organizations and the broader communities in which they serve. A leader's decisions create a moral blueprint that others often follow, whether it be consciously or subconsciously. So keep that in the forefront of your mind as we go through this. Ethical leadership isn't just about achieving results. It's about how they are achieved. So as Dwight D. Eisenhower once said, the supreme quality for leadership is unquestionably integrity. Integrity is the backbone of ethical leadership, influencing every leader's decision and action. It sets ethical leaders apart and inspires those around them to follow their example. So whether you're a seasoned executive, an emerging leader, or someone passionate about doing the right thing, this episode is for you. So let's just get ready to jump on in. The discussion points for this episode, there are three. We'll talk about how leaders set the ethical climate within their organizations, how they establish strong ethical standards, and finally, we'll highlight some real-life examples of leaders whose ethical choices had a lasting impact. But before we get to those discussion points, let's define ethical leadership. So let's delve into what it truly means to be an ethical leader. Ethical leadership can be defined as the practice of guiding and influencing others with integrity, fairness, and moral principles. It involves making decisions that prioritize the well-being of people, uphold honesty and transparency, and align values that promote justice and respect. Ethical leaders lead by example, fostering trust and accountability within their organizations and their communities. So what are some traits of ethical leaders? We'll identify 5. The first trait is integrity. We can't get away from that word. It's one of my favorites. Ethical leaders, they consistently act in alignment with their values and principles, even when faced with challenges. Ethical leaders also display transparency, meaning that they openly communicate their decisions and reasoning, and this fosters trust within their teams. Ethical leaders are empathetic. They understand and consider the perspectives and feelings of others, and they promote inclusivity and fairness. Ethical leaders also demonstrate accountability. They take personal responsibility for their actions and decisions, and they ensure that they themselves uphold ethical standards. And lastly, ethical leaders are courageous. They demonstrate courage because they are willing to stand up for what is right, even in the most difficult of situations. Ethical leadership stands out from other leadership styles in that its consistent focus is on moral principles, integrity, and the welfare of others. So, while those other leadership approaches aim to achieve specific goals, ethical leadership emphasizes the how. How will these goals be achieved? And it also ensures that the decisions of the leaders align with values and fairness. Some of the key differences of ethical leadership or ethical leaders from other leadership styles, like a transformational leader or, some of the other types, there are so many. Ethical leaders, they focus on ethics and values, like we just talked about. They prioritize doing what is right over achieving the results. Ethical leaders have a people-centric approach. They emphasize the well-being and development of their teams. And they also have a long-term impact or a strategic focus, if you will. They seek sustainable outcomes that benefit the organization and society at large. And then lastly, ethical leaders, they have a decision-making framework. This is the final difference between ethical leaders and other leaders. They make their decisions based on fairness and moral principles. So just think about that. When those two things, fairness and moral principles, are at the forefront of your mind, when you make your decisions versus, the organization's bottom line, or, those goals that, the senior leadership is telling you that you have to make. And you can still make those, but just keep in mind, that fairness and moral principles will be those two things that guide and shape how you go about achieving those goals. So as we explore ethical leadership and its focus on integrity, fairness, and the welfare of others, one of its most powerful impacts is its ability to shape organizational culture. This was what makes it so special to me, why I like it so much, because ethical leaders, they not only guide individuals, they set the tone for how values and principles are lived within the organization. And so this brings us to our very first discussion point. How do leaders set the ethical climate within their organizations? So let's just, jump right on in and talk about how they can foster environments where ethics thrive and inspire positive ripple effects, because we're talking about ripple effects, right? How they inspire ripple effects across teams and communities. So when it comes to setting the ethical climate within an organization, leaders must embody the principles they wish to instill. Hence the name of the radio show, leading by example. As Edward Hennessy reminds us, ethics must begin at the top of an organization. It is a leadership issue, and the chief executive must set the example. Not just the chief executive, but all of the chief executives must set the example. This means that leaders not only influence policies, but they also set the tone through their daily actions, fostering trust and accountability among their teams. And that trust is fostered because there should be consistency in those actions. So, the first point is that ethical leaders, they role model ethical behavior. Leaders act as role models, as their actions, again, set the tone for what is acceptable within the organization. Social learning theory suggests that individuals tend to emulate the behavior of those they admire or perceive as authoritative. And, just, when you go to work tomorrow, just kind of take a look around and just watch. I was always so mesmerized by this. I continue to be mesmerized by this simple, concept just from watching people. Because if you are a persuasive type leader, because leadership is influence, people will begin to emulate what you do. I remember when I was in the military, when I was in the Army, and we were training for Iraq. So I'm a girly girl. I don't care what the context is. I'm going to always have some lip gloss or something on my lips, put something on my face, and have my hair nice and neat. And so when I first took over command, I told all of the females, all the women within my formation, part of your maintenance is grooming yourself. Not saying you got to be overdone, but, look like a professional. And so I began to notice that, some of them would have their hair in a similar style as mine, and, wearing similar type lip gloss. I thought that was like so awesome, and even pressing their uniforms, brushing off their boots. That was huge to me. So it made me, on those nights when I was too tired, I still pushed because I knew people were watching, and that's something that leaders should always remember. But moving right along. Ethical leaders also establish clear ethical standards. So these leaders must articulate and communicate clear ethical standards through codes of conduct, mission statements, and organizational values. A well-defined ethical framework, this gives employees some type of, left and right limits for decision-making and their behavior. So leaders who continuously reinforce these standards ensure that ethics can become embedded in the organization's operations. So you definitely want to document these, the mission statement and codes of conduct and the organization's values, and place them in a location where all can see, because they should guide, the decision making of those within the ranks or within that organization when that leader is not there to communicate, what it should be or what it could be. Ethical leaders also create an open environment by fostering a climate of open communication and psychological safety. It's one of my favorite words. Psychological safety. Leaders can encourage employees to voice concerns about unethical practices without fear of retaliation. So this involves, things like implementing whistleblower policies or creating channels for ethical concerns to be reported confidentially and addressed. And it also is as simple as when you're having a meeting and you see someone is not talking, just kind of notice why, or, ask that person after the meeting, hey, why didn't you say too much? You were kind of quiet. Sometimes you may find that, this person will say, oh, I just noticed whenever I say something, I see people eyes roll. So, that person does not have psychological safety. So you may want to begin, putting some ground rules into place before each meeting, like, codes of conduct or, standards for how we're going to, demonstrate respect, amongst the team to one another. We're not going to eye roll when somebody speaks. We're going to listen and let them be heard, as an example. So anyway, leaders want to create an open environment, and that begins with, again, fostering that psychological safety, because once that's there, employees will feel empowered and they'll feel safe to, voice their concerns and share their ideas freely. And that's what we all want, because that's what makes organizations thrive and, just a fun place to be. And here's a fun quote that reads, an open environment is one where everyone feels safe to express their thoughts and ideas without fear of judgment or retaliation. Author unknown, but I love that. Leaders can achieve this by actively listening, encouraging transparency, and demonstrating empathy in their interactions. When people know that their voices are heard and respected, this builds trust among their leaders and among their peers, and it strengthens collaboration and reinforces the ethical climate of their organization. Ethical leaders also promote accountability. They set the ethical climate by holding themselves and others accountable for their actions. This includes establishing systems to monitor compliance with ethical standards and applying consistent consequences for violations, regardless of somebody's position or, rank, whether it be the military or just, a regular civilian organization. You want to make sure that, those consequences are, applied fairly and uniformly across and throughout the organization. And accountability ensures that ethical standards are upheld, preventing reputational damage. So as Warren Buffett, he's one of my favorites, probably the favorite. He reminds us it takes 20 years to build a reputation, but it only takes 5 minutes to ruin it. Just think about that. Accountability keeps that 5 minutes from undermining decades of hard work. So just keep that in mind. You don't want all your hard work to just, be for naught and just go down the wayside because of a poor decision, whether it be intentional or not, just ruined your reputation. That's like so not fair, to you and your hard work. So just keep it in mind. And as we go further, throughout, this show, we'll address some of the things that, you can do to make sure that your ethics are on point. So, the fifth point is that ethical leaders, they also integrate ethics into their decision-making. Huge, huge, huge. This involves incorporating moral principles into decision-making processes at all levels of the organization. And it's not just this one person. You want to, build this into, the organization's culture. Leaders do this by considering the long-term consequences of their actions on their stakeholders or their constituents, and they ensure alignment with the organization's core values. So you want to make sure that, there is, that is parallel. You don't want it to be disjointed. And then lastly, ethical leaders, they provide ethical training. I know it can be like boring, but, it's a thing that organizations, everyone needs to have that refresher from time to time. Leaders can enhance the ethical climate by, offering the regular training programs, the blah, 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 log in, do the automated or, the computer-based training to educate, the employees on ethical dilemmas and decision-making frameworks and the importance of integrity. This ensures that the organization's ethical awareness remains priority across the organization. Something that simple, even though sometimes it can be in pain and it takes a little of your time, but this is how ethical leaders drive this home throughout the organization. And just keep in mind that ethical training is not just about workshops or policy manuals or computer-based training. It's about setting examples through leadership. This is probably the most important and salient training that you can give your employees by modeling the example of ethical leadership. And as John Wooden wisely said, being a role model is the most powerful form of educating. Leaders who actively participate in ethical training and demonstrate the values they wish to instill become the cornerstone of an organization's ethical foundation. Don't you want to be the cornerstone? That's like huge. I want somebody to call me the cornerstone. And so when employees see leaders engaging with the same, material and practices, and acknowledging the importance of, dealing ethically and applying ethics within their decisions, the training transcends theory and becomes a lived experience that's, emulated and modeled throughout the organization. It's just so beautiful. And then, lastly, the last thing that ethical leaders do is that they recognize and they reward ethical behavior. Excuse me. Acknowledging and rewarding employees who demonstrate ethical behavior reinforces the value of ethics within the organization. So leaders can use recognition programs, or they can integrate ethical performance into formal evaluation systems, which is what's done in the military, what I'm most familiar with. And I do believe I'm a contractor. I do believe that the government, I support the government. I do believe that they have something that addresses ethics within their report. And so, having explored the essential strategies that ethical leaders can use to set the ethical climate within their organizations, like role modeling and fostering accountability and open communications, let's distill these practical applications into a practical tool. So I would like to introduce to you a mnemonic. A mnemonic is, just a little, a word, where each letter means something. So the mnemonic for, ethical strategies to, set the ethical climate within organizations is so cute. Clear path. The word clear, that's Charlie, Lima, Echo, Alpha, Romeo, and then path. And this is a concise framework designed to help ethical leaders navigate the journey of building and sustaining ethical environments with, not just clarity, but also purpose. So think about this. Clear path. The C stands for communicate ethical standards. Ethical leaders want to clearly articulate the organization's values, its mission, its ethical guidelines. We talked about this. L, they want to lead by example, my favorite. Ethical leaders want to serve as a role model by demonstrating integrity and fairness in every decision. Ethical leaders, they want to empower their employees by creating an environment where team members feel confident, acting ethically, and speaking up against misconduct. There's that psychological safety. That's where psychological safety comes into play, because that environment is conducive to people speaking out when they see wrong. Accountability, that's ensuring that everyone is held responsible for their actions, including those within leadership positions. And ethical leaders want to recognize ethical behavior by celebrating and rewarding individuals who act in alignment with, the ethical principles that are espoused by the organization. And for PATH, the P is for provide training, right? So offer regular ethical training to reinforce awareness and decision-making skills. A, align those policies with values, ensure organizational systems and policies reflect those ethical priorities. T, transparent decision-making. Ethical leaders want to be open about how and why decisions are made to build trust. Doesn't it make you feel good when, leaders, have something to announce at like an all hands, and instead of you walking away like, because they don't share with you, those things that happen behind the scene that help them arrive at that particular conclusion, they make you feel, really good and warm and like you're really part of the team when they share with you, how they made those decisions. That's transparency and decision-making. And then lastly, H, handle ethical concerns fairly. And that is to ethical leaders establish safe channels for employees to report ethical issues and address them objectively. So clear path. I will post these on LinkedIn and some of my other social media profiles, which I don't memorize offhand, but they will be posted. All right, so, just to wrap up the clear path mnemonic, again, it's just a practical framework for ethical leaders to navigate the complexities of ethical decision-making, because ethical decision-making is a complex thing. So, clear path is just the cutest little mnemonic that helps us, right? This mnemonic, it emphasizes integrity, fairness, and transparency as its guiding principles. And as Eleanor Roosevelt beautifully said, she said, to handle yourself, use your head. To handle others, Use your heart. So that's where the integrity and transparency comes in. Use your heart and be open. This highlights the balance that leaders must strike between thoughtful strategy and empathetic connection to those that are, within their leadership. So now that we've broken down the clear path mnemonic as a practical framework for ethical leadership, let's take a closer look at one of the most crucial aspects of this journey, which is establishing strong ethical standards. So ethical leaders lay the groundwork for success by setting clear expectations, modeling integrity, and fostering accountability. So in this next section, or our next discussion point, we'll explore how leaders create and uphold these standards to guide their organizations with both purpose and principle. So, how do leaders establish strong ethical standards? Establishing ethical standards requires deliberate effort and consistency. Ethical leaders develop a foundation rooted in honesty and fairness, ensuring that every decision reflects these principles. As Simon Sinek wisely said, leadership is not about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge. So, you may want to note that for some people in your organization, they got those two parts backwards. So through this people-centric approach, leaders inspire their teams to uphold ethical practices and foster collaboration. One way that ethical leaders establish ethical standards is by defining the organization's core values. This goes back to the mission statement and, the codes of conduct that we talked about. Leaders begin by, identifying those fundamental ethical principles that align with the organization's vision and its mission. Values, again, such as integrity, fairness, and respect, serve as the foundation for ethical standards. And there are others, not just those three. Research by Trevino and Weaver highlights that clearly articulated values are essential for guiding behavior and decision-making within organizations. Clearly articulated. So, post it on the company website, post it on walls, or, anywhere that the organization's members tend to gather and read things, because again, you want these things clearly articulated because they do guide behavior for decision-making for not just the leaders, but, those that are, under your leadership and those subordinate leaders. So again, what are some leadership actions, with defining core values? Ethical leaders, they develop the codes of conduct or ethics statement, because they help, build a roadmap for ethical decision making. And then they incorporate these ethical values into mission statements that, emphasize, the importance of these codes or these statements. And then we cannot get away from leading by example, y'all. Ethical leaders, they solidify ethical standards through their own actions. Firstly, according to social learning theory, employees mirror the behaviors of their leaders. We talked about that, right? When leaders demonstrate fairness, honesty, and accountability, they reinforce the expectation that others should do the same. So an ethical leader can do this by publicly acknowledging, ethical dilemmas. Don't turn a blind eye to it. Let people know what it is, and help them understand, when it exists, because some people may not always get it. And explain how that ethical dilemma was, resolved with integrity. And then, again, ethical leaders want to take responsibility for any mistakes, all mistakes, or, unethical decisions to show accountability. And we're all human. No one is perfect. But, in your own personal reflections, and when you've made a decision and you realize that that wasn't, on point, or that was a little whack, go back and address that. I guarantee you that, whereas you may feel shame and embarrassment, you won't take a L. It's a win for you and your team. Organizations or, ethical leaders, they can also establish ethics committees, to oversee compliance. Look at all of the organization's policies and practices to make sure that they align with the ethical standards that, that the ethical leaders are trying to communicate. And, again, like we talked about, you want to integrate those ethical criteria into performance evaluations and reward systems. Ethical leaders also want to communicate those ethical expectations. So again, we talked about, posting the mission statements and codes of conduct, but you also want to communicate these in, your regular discussions with your teams or your organization in team meetings, all hands, training sessions, anything, internal communications, mass blasts, emails, or whatever. Always lace those with some type of ethical principles just to, keep employees mindful and ensure them that, they understand the organization's commitment to these principles. And then, the last thing is, not last thing, is, ethical leaders, they create a safe environment. Again, that psychological safety. So, implementing whistleblower policies. I know that's something that, you know, with the current political environment, some organizations are getting away from, which is, a little scary in and of itself, but, implementing whistleblower policies and, confidential reporting mechanisms. So that way employees not only have that psychological safety, but, perhaps that physical safety of coming forward and, sharing that information with leadership without fear of, reprisal, I'm country, or retaliation. And then lastly, ethical leaders promote accountability. They ensure that these ethical standards are upheld by holding all individuals accountable for their actions and consistently enforcing, whatever those consequences are for violations. And then also, not just recognizing or enforcing the consequences for violations, but also recognizing, good ethical behavior. So to wrap up the first and second discussion points, we'll explore the connection between leadership behavior and organizational systems in fostering ethical standards. So leaders influence the development of systems and ensure their enforcement, while systems provide the structure and tools necessary to sustain the organization's ethical practices. So again, this goes back to the research I mentioned by Trevino and Weaver. I'm going to put some training together on the elements. So once I get that done, I'm going to post a note on, social media, and the course will be free. I want you to go back and take a look at it. But again, it references Trevino and Weaver's ethical leadership model. And this model is a framework for highlighting the influence of leadership behavior and organizational systems on ethical climates, and then also Victor and Cullen's ethical climate theory. And they basically found that leaders affect the ethical work climate by shaping shared perceptions of what behaviors are rewarded, supported, or expected within the organization. They emphasize that ethical leadership and robust organizational frameworks complement each other to create a strong ethical culture within an organization. So leadership behavior, setting the tone. Trevino and Weaver, their study found that the importance of leaders serving as ethical role models. This directly influences, employees' perceptions of acceptable conduct. This goes back to that, social learning theory we talked about. And this is because ethical leaders, they demonstrate integrity, they engage in transparent communication, and they encourage ethical practices. So Trevino's research on social learning theory, it highlighted how employees tend to emulate, the behavior of ethical leaders and, an unethical leader on the flip side. So ethical leadership, it creates ripple effects, inspiring similar values and practices across all levels of an organization. Now, as for organizational systems, these things serve to reinforce those standards. So in Victor and Cullen's ethical climate theory, it complements this perspective by examining how organization systems influence the ethical work climate. So, ethical climates are shared and shaped by, the perceptions of what behaviors are rewarded, again, supported, or expected within an organization. Effective organizational systems, nothing huge or, nothing with AI and code. It's something as simple as policies and codes. So clear ethical guidelines, that provide employees with a framework for decision making, or accountability mechanisms. Again, that's the performance evaluations that have ethical criteria, interwoven into, your assessments, audits, by the way of committees. And then also, again, consistent consequences for violations of those ethical standards to ensure that they are upheld. And then lastly, our little regular training programs, sometimes they can be boring, but very necessary. And again, regular education, it fosters the awareness and equips employees to handle ethical dilemmas. And again, like we mentioned, we talked about briefly earlier, not just training, but you can also, weave these reminders, these ethical reminders into your weekly correspondence or your daily correspondence across your organizations or, within your teams. So, just a couple, of an example, an in practice example of a leader who demonstrates transparency in decision making. This type of leader will also promote, whistleblower policies, that encourage the open communication. And then also, ethical leaders, working closely with HR teams or ethics committees, they are, likely to integrate ethical standards into hiring, training, and, evaluation processes. So ultimately, this interplay, it ensures that ethical standards are not only promoted, but deeply embedded or baked into the organization's culture. And this benefits both the organization and its stakeholders. So what can you do now? We've heard all this nice little content about, ethical leaders and what they do, and how these things, benefit the organization. What can you do now to put this to work? Well, you can walk the talk. So if you're, going through your organization, you're talking about the organization's ethics, and you're trying to, remind people of, what those things are, and you're putting out communications, make sure that, you embody the ethical values. The second thing that, you can do is develop ethical training programs. Again, reinforce those ethical expectations through training and real world scenario discussions, especially, there's nothing better than, something that may have happened within the organization, something that, pretty much everyone can relate to, and you can turn that into a real life case study about, how we can do better next time. This is learning. There are no L's in learning in my book. And then, ethical leaders can, implement accountability measures, and you do this by establishing independent oversight committees or, an ethics board to ensure transparency. And I know pretty much every organization has a, a legal department, make sure they're included. And then lastly, you want to reward ethical behavior, right? You want to recognize and incentivize those who demonstrate integrity within their, decision making. So having, explored how, you can, establish strong ethical standards and clear values through role modeling and systems of accountability, let's put a nice little pretty bow on all of these principles and bring them to life with some real world examples. We'll look at some public and private sector leaders whose ethical choices, not only defined their leadership, but also left a lasting impact on, the organization in which they served or that institution in which they served. So, here we go. So these ethical leaders, they demonstrated the power of, their choices to shape organizations and communities. And, their narratives that I'm going to read to you shortly, they remind us that, this quote right here, they remind us that the greatness of a leader is measured by the principles that they live by. Ethical decisions create ripple effects, extending far beyond the moment and inspiring others to follow suit. So here we go with our first example. Nelson Mandela. He displayed ethical leadership in reconciliation. So Nelson Mandela's leadership exemplified the power of forgiveness and justice in healing a divided nation. As South Africa's first democratically elected president, Nelson Mandela prioritized reconciliation over retribution following decades of apartheid. His decision to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission allowed victims and perpetrators to share their stories. This fostered understanding and unity. Mandela's ethical choices inspired global movements for equality and human rights, and this left a legacy of hope and resilience for us all. The next example is, our former President Barack Obama. Through his, practice of transparency and inclusivity, his presidency was marked by, these two things: transparency, inclusivity, and ethical governance. He implemented policies such as the Affordable Care Act, which expanded healthcare access to millions, and the Paris Climate Agreement, which emphasized global cooperation on environmental issues. His ethical leadership extended to his efforts to reduce the influence of lobbyists and promote open government. And again, his choices reinforced the importance of integrity and public service and inspired future leaders to prioritize accountability. Our first private sector example is Paul Polman. He displayed sustainability and accountability as the CEO of Unilever. He implemented or integrated sustainability and accountability into the company's core strategy through his introduction of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which aimed to double the company's growth while reducing its environmental footprint and improving social outcomes. His ethical leadership emphasized long-term impact over short-term profits, and this set a benchmark for responsible business practices. Paul Polman's legacy continues to influence global corporations to adopt sustainable and ethical models. And then for our last example, Satya Nadella, their practice was empathy and innovation through their leadership at Microsoft. So their integration of empathy and innovation transformed Microsoft's culture and operations by fostering a growth mindset and emphasizing empathy. Nadella created an inclusive environment that encouraged innovation and ethical decision-making, and his commitment to accessibility and fairness led to initiatives that prioritize ethical technology development, such as reducing bias in AI systems. Huge, huge, huge. His choices also had a lasting impact on Microsoft's reputation and the broader, technology industry. So these leaders that we just briefly discussed here demonstrated, and they continue to demonstrate, how ethical choices can inspire trust, drive positive change, and create enduring legacies. So this was, our little content in a nutshell for this show. So, the final thought, as my final thought, Dr. Vaughn's final thought, the power of ethical leadership lies in its ability to inspire lasting change. Leaders who act with integrity, transparency, and accountability not only shape their organizations, but also ripple out positive impacts across communities and industries. Their choices, though sometimes challenging, set the standard for others to follow, proving that ethical decisions are not just admirable, but essential for building a better future. So keep that in mind, y'all. That just hit me to my soul, because, sometimes we get into a little humdrum and, we feel like our actions don't matter, but they do. So in closing, as we've explored today, ethical leadership is more than just a philosophy. It's a practice that creates trust, drives innovation, and ensures sustainable success. From reconciliation in the public sector to responsible business in the private sector, ethical leaders show us that integrity is a timeless force for transformation. By celebrating these examples and embodying their values, we can all collectively contribute to the ripple effect of ethical choices. A special thank you to my producer, Mr. Stephen Anderson, for keeping me on target and ensuring today's episode ran smoothly. Please be sure to join me again for the next episode on Thursday, May 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we'll explore ethical choices in everyday business. It will be another engaging and impactful conversation that you won't want to miss. So thank you for tuning in to The Ripple Effect, how one ethical choice can inspire many. This was our very first episode titled The Power of Ethical Leadership. Ethical leadership is about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. It's about creating positive ripple effects that inspire others to act with integrity, transparency, and empathy. So as we reflect on today's discussion, remember that every ethical choice can transform your workplace, your community, and your world. Create that ripple effect, y'all. It's a beautiful thing. So thank you for joining me on this journey. And as always, take care and continue to lead by example. Bye. You have been listening to Leading by Example, upholding standards without compromise. Bringing you inspiring excellence, one lesson at a time. Tune in to Transformation Talk Radio every first and third Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific for fun, practical, and educational stories as I share lessons, both the good and the bad, that I have learned in my 20 years of leadership and management experience. As we go through and learn these lessons, I would ask you to be thinking about those lessons that you bring, that you could share for potential, hey, you may even want to be a guest on our show. So think about those lessons as we continue to explore inspiring excellence, one lesson at a time. For more information, please visit www.enterosolutions.com. That's ENTERO.